Chapter 1: The Self That Never Was versus the Self That Must Be Created. You have spent your entire life protecting something that does not exist. Pause for a moment and feel the weight of that sentence. Not as an idea, not as a philosophy, but as a quiet disturbance inside your chest. There is a subtle fear that arises when the ground beneath identity begins to tremble. Because if what you call I is not real, then what exactly have you been defending, improving, comparing, and fearing for all these years? And yet, in the same breath, another voice whispers, if there is no self, then why does there remain such a strong urge to become something more? This is where the tension begins. Not as a contradiction to be solved, but as a fire to be lived. From one side, there is the insight that the self is like a mirage in a desert. You chase it, you describe it, you even suffer for it, but when you try to grasp it directly, it dissolves into shifting sands. Thoughts arise, sensations pass, memories flicker, emotions surge and fade. At no point can you point to something solid and say, this is me. The body changes, the mind changes, even your deepest beliefs are replaced over time. What you call yourself is more like a river than a rock, always moving, never the same. But from another side, there is an undeniable pull, a quiet command from within, to shape your life, to carve meaning out of chaos, to rise above mere drifting. There is something in you that refuses to remain passive. It does not want to simply observe the river. It wants to direct its flow, to become the sculptor of its own existence. So which is true? Is the self an illusion to be seen through, or a creation to be built? The mind, addicted to clarity, demands a single answer. But existence does not obey the mind's need for simplicity. It invites you instead into a paradox. Look closely. The self you think you are, the fixed identity, the story you repeat, the image you protect, is indeed a construction. But it is not a conscious creation. It is something that has been assembled for you, piece, by society, by family, by fear, by memory. It is a borrowed mask that you have worn for so long that it has begun to feel like your skin. This is the self that never truly was. It is not false in the sense that it does not function. It functions very well. It navigates the world, forms relationships, makes decisions. But it is false in the sense that it is not rooted in direct awareness. It is a second-hand identity, stitched together from impressions and expectations. And the deeper tragedy is not that this self is illusory, but that it is unconscious. You did not choose it. You inherited it. And because you did not create it, you are bound by it. Its fears become your fears. Its limitations become your boundaries. Its past becomes your prison. Now here is where the second movement begins, the birth of something radically different. If the given self is not truly yours, then there arises a possibility, not to discover a hidden, permanent essence, but to create a self that is consciously chosen. But be careful. This is not about replacing one illusion with another. It is not about constructing a stronger ego to hide the fragility beneath. That would only deepen the unconscious game. The creation being spoken of here is something far more subtle. It begins not with building, but with seeing. You must first see clearly that what you have called I is a collection of habits. You must observe it as you would watch clouds passing in the sky, without clinging, without resistance. In that observation, a distance begins to form. And in that distance, something silent awakens. It does not speak. It does not claim. It does not define itself. It simply is. From this silence, a new kind of creation becomes possible. Not driven by fear, not shaped by comparison, but emerging from clarity. This is where the paradox deepens. Only when you see that there is no fixed self do you become free to shape yourself. The one who was trying to become something, out of insecurity, out of lack, was trapped in illusion. But the one who sees through the illusion is no longer compelled. And yet, from that freedom, a new movement arises, not out of need, but out of possibility. It is like an artist who no longer paints to prove their worth, but paints because creation itself has become an expression of their being. This is the self that must be created. Not because it is ultimately real, but because it is consciously formed. Not because it will last forever, but because it is lived fully in the moment. And here, a strange realization emerges. The self that is created with awareness is lighter than the self that was unconsciously inherited. It does not cling to permanence. It does not demand validation. It knows its own fluidity. It becomes like a flame, constantly changing, yet unmistakably present. But there is a danger here as well. The mind, once it hears about creating the self, may rush to construct new identities, stronger, more admirable, more powerful. It may say, I will become this. I will achieve that. I will define myself in these terms. And once again, it begins to build a cage, only this time with more polished bars. True creation does not come from the mind's desire to become something. It comes from a deeper alignment, where action flows naturally, without the weight of self-definition. Ask yourself, when you act without thinking about who you are, without trying to protect or enhance an image, what remains? There is a certain purity in those moments, a directness, a simplicity. That is where real creation begins. It is not about becoming a better self. It is about allowing a way of being to unfold that is not burdened by the illusion of a fixed identity. And yet, even this must not become a belief. Because the moment you say, this is who I truly am, you have already begun to solidify something that is meant to remain fluid. So you stand at a crossroads that is not really a crossroads. On one side, the realization that there is no permanent self to cling to. On the other, the invitation to consciously shape your existence. If you cling to the first, you may fall into passivity, a kind of quiet escape from life. If you cling to the second, you may fall into ego, a restless striving to become. But if you hold both lightly, something entirely different happens. You begin to live without the burden of a fixed identity, yet with the intensity of a creator. You become both empty and expressive, both silent and active, both nothing, and yet, in your actions, something entirely unique. And perhaps this is the deeper truth that cannot be captured in definitions. The self was never something to be found, nor was it something to be permanently built. It is something that appears and disappears, like a dance between awareness and expression. And the moment you try to hold it still, you lose it. So the question is not, who am I? Nor is it, who should I become? The question is far more unsettling and far more alive. Can you live without needing a final answer? Can you move through life without clinging to a fixed identity, yet still act with clarity and intensity? Can you allow yourself to be both a void and a creator? Sit with this, not as a problem to solve, but as a doorway. Because the one who seeks certainty will remain trapped in the illusion of self. But the one who dares to stand in this paradox may discover a freedom that cannot be named. A freedom that does not come from knowing who you are, but from no longer needing to know. Chapter 2, Anatta versus the birth of the individual. There is a quiet terror in realizing that there is no one inside. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. No fixed center, no unchanging witness you can hold and call me. Only shifting sensations, rising thoughts, fading emotions, an endless procession with no owner behind them. At first, this realization does not feel like freedom. It feels like erasure. If there is no one within, then who suffers? Who desires? Who chooses? Who walks this path at all? And yet, strangely, life continues. Breathing happens. Choices are made. Words are spoken. Laughter arises, and so does sorrow. The absence of a fixed self does not stop the movement of existence. It only removes the illusion that there was ever a controller at the center of it. This is the insight that cuts deep. The sense of I is not the source of life. It is a shadow cast by it. Watch closely. A thought appears. I should do this. But where did that thought come from? Did you choose it, or did it arrive on its own? And the next thought, and the next, are they truly yours, or are they simply happening? Even the feeling of ownership, my thought, my feeling, my decision. Is itself another thought, appearing just like the rest? If you observe long enough, something unsettling becomes clear. The one who claims ownership is part of the same flow it tries to control. There is no separate ruler, only the illusion of one. This is what is meant by the absence of a fixed self. Not that nothing exists, but that there is no permanent identity beneath the flow of experience. And if you allow this understanding to deepen, something begins to loosen. The grip of identity softens. The constant need to defend, to justify, to maintain an image starts to fade. You no longer feel the same urgency to prove yourself, because the one you were trying to prove was never stable to begin with. There is a lightness in this, but also a danger. Because when the sense of self dissolves, there is a temptation to drift, to become passive, detached, indifferent. To say, if there is no self, then nothing matters. And in this quiet withdrawal, life loses its sharpness. But look again. Is this detachment truly freedom, or is it another escape? Because even the absence of a fixed self does not erase the fact that life expresses itself uniquely through this body, this mind, this moment. The river has no fixed identity, and yet it flows in a particular direction. The wind has no self, and yet it moves with a certain force. In the same way, even without a permanent I, there is still a pattern, a tendency, a way in which life unfolds through you. And here, something new begins to emerge, not as a contradiction to the absence of self, but as a response to it. The birth of the individual. Not the individual as a fixed identity, but as a conscious expression. When you are no longer bound by an inherited sense of self, you are no longer confined to its patterns. You are no longer forced to repeat the same fears, the same desires, the same limitations. There is space now, a space in which something new can take shape. But what will shape it? If there is no fixed self, then the individual cannot be something you discover, like a hidden treasure waiting to be found. It must be something that emerges through choice, through action, through the way you engage with existence. And this is where the tension sharpens. On one hand, you see that there is no permanent you. On the other, you feel the undeniable urge to become someone, to stand, to act, to define a direction. This is not a contradiction. It is a dance. The absence of a fixed self does not eliminate individuality. It makes it possible. Because if you were already a fixed being, there would be nothing to create. You would simply be what you are, forever. But because there is no permanent essence, there is freedom, not to become anything arbitrarily, but to consciously participate in the shaping of your life. The individual, then, is not something given. It is something forged. But forged from what? Not from ego, not from the desperate need to assert yourself over others. That kind of individuality is still rooted in illusion. It is still reacting, still seeking validation, still trapped in comparison. True individuality arises when you are no longer trying to prove that you exist. It arises when your actions are no longer driven by the need to solidify a self-image. It arises when you act not from insecurity, but from clarity. In that clarity, something unique begins to take form. Not because you are trying to be unique, but because you are no longer imitating, no longer conforming unconsciously. You become like a clear mirror, reflecting life in a way that no one else can, simply because no one else stands in the exact place you do. And yet, even this individuality must remain fluid. The moment you cling to it, this is who I am, this is my identity, you begin to solidify it into something rigid. And what was once a living expression becomes another mask. So the birth of the individual is not a one-time event. It is a continuous process, a constant unfolding, a movement that requires both awareness and courage. Awareness, to see through the illusion of a fixed self. Courage, to act without needing that illusion for support. Because without a fixed identity, there is a kind of vulnerability. There is no solid ground to stand on, no permanent definition to hide behind. You are exposed to uncertainty, to change, to the unknown. But it is precisely in this exposure that real strength is born. Not the strength of a rigid self, but the strength of fluidity. The strength to adapt, to evolve, to create without being confined. And perhaps this is the deeper paradox. The more you see that there is no fixed self, the more capable you become of expressing a true individuality. Because what you express is no longer filtered through layers of conditioning, no longer shaped by unconscious patterns. It becomes direct, immediate, alive. But this requires a delicate balance. If you lean too much into the absence of self, you may dissolve into passivity. If you lean too much into individuality, you may harden into ego. The art is to remain in between, to let the sense of self remain light, flexible, almost transparent, while still engaging with life fully. To act, but not from a fixed identity. To create, but not to solidify yourself. To become, but without clinging to what you become. And in this way, something extraordinary happens. You begin to live as both no one and someone. No one, because there is no permanent essence to defend. Someone, because your actions, your choices, your presence leave a distinct imprint on the world. You are like a wave in the ocean, formless in essence, yet unmistakable in expression. The wave does not need to claim an identity to rise. And yet, when it rises, it is entirely itself. So perhaps the question is not whether the self exists or not. Perhaps the question is, Can you allow individuality to emerge without turning it into an identity? Can you move through life without a fixed center, yet still stand with clarity and direction? Can you let yourself be shaped by existence, while also shaping the way you respond to it? Sit with this tension. Do not rush to resolve it, because in that unresolved space, something deeper than certainty begins to awaken. Not a self you can define, but a way of being you can only live. Chapter 3: Dissolving Identity versus Forging Identity. There comes a moment when every identity you have ever worn begins to feel like a costume that has overstayed its purpose. At first, you do not notice it. You move through life as a name, a role, a personality, something defined and familiar. You say, "This is who I am," and the world seems to agree. It reflects your image back to you, reinforcing it, stabilizing it. And in that repetition, you begin to believe it. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks begin to appear. You react in ways that surprise you. You contradict your own beliefs. You outgrow desires that once defined you. And in quiet moments, when no one is watching, when no role is required, you feel a strange emptiness, as if the person you have been performing has stepped aside, leaving behind a silent space. It is in this space that a question arises, not from the mind, but from somewhere deeper. Was I ever this identity, or was I only playing it? To dissolve identity is not to destroy something real. It is to see that what you thought was solid was always in motion. Look at any identity you hold. Perhaps you see yourself as strong or kind, or intelligent or broken. These are not facts, they are patterns. Repeated thoughts, reinforced behaviors, accumulated experiences. Over time, they form a narrative, and that narrative begins to feel like truth. But if you observe closely, you will notice that none of these qualities remain constant. Strength turns into vulnerability. Kindness gives way to anger. Clarity dissolves into confusion. And yet you continue to say, "This is who I am." Why? Because the mind seeks continuity. It fears fragmentation. It wants a stable story to hold on to, even if that story is incomplete, even if it is false. So it stitches together moments, creates a sense of consistency, and calls it identity. But identity is not something you are. It is something you maintain, and maintenance requires effort. Have you noticed how exhausting it is to be someone? To constantly align your actions with your self-image, to protect it from contradiction, to defend it against others' perceptions. Even when you succeed, there is tension beneath it, a subtle anxiety that it might collapse. Because deep down, you sense that it is not as stable as it appears. To dissolve identity is to stop maintaining this illusion. Not by force, not by rejection, but through seeing. When you see clearly that identity is constructed, something loosens. You no longer feel the same urgency to define yourself so rigidly. You allow contradictions. You allow change. You allow yourself to not know who you are. And in that not knowing, there is a quiet freedom. But again, this freedom carries a risk. Because when identity dissolves, so does the structure that gave your life direction. Without a fixed sense of self, it becomes easy to drift, to move without intention, to exist without depth. The absence of identity can feel like openness, but it can also feel like emptiness. And here, another voice begins to rise. Not the voice of conditioning, not the voice of fear, but something more deliberate. It asks, if you are not bound by any identity, then what will you choose to become? This is where forging begins. Not as a reaction to the loss of identity, but as a conscious act. Forging identity is not about discovering a pre-existing self. It is about shaping your way of being through awareness and intention. But understand this carefully. The identity you forge must not become a prison. It must remain a tool. A sword, not a cage. Because the moment you begin to believe that what you have created is who you are, you fall back into the same illusion. Only this time, you are its architect. So how does one forge identity without being trapped by it? By holding it lightly. By understanding that what you are creating is not an absolute truth, but a functional expression. You may choose to embody strength, not because you are inherently strong, but because you see value in acting with strength. You may choose clarity, discipline, compassion, not as fixed traits, but as directions. In this way, identity becomes dynamic. It is no longer something you defend, but something you refine. And because it is consciously chosen, it carries a different quality. It is not rigid. It adapts. It evolves. It is like a sculptor working with clay, not trying to reveal a hidden statue, but shaping and reshaping as the vision deepens. But even here, a subtle danger remains. The mind may take pride in its creation. It may say, "This is who I have become," and begin to attach to it. It may compare itself to others, seek validation, reinforce the identity it has built. And in that moment, the fluidity is lost. The forged identity becomes as rigid as the inherited one. So the challenge is not only to create, but to remain free within what you create. To act with intention, but without attachment. To embody qualities, but without solidifying them into a fixed self. This requires a certain alertness, a constant awareness that what you are expressing is not what you are. That identity, whether inherited or forged, is always a surface phenomenon. Beneath it, there remains something untouched, something that does not need to define itself, does not need to become anything. And yet, it allows becoming to happen. This is where the paradox becomes most alive. You dissolve identity, and in doing so, you become free. You forge identity, and in doing so, you give direction to that freedom. But if you cling to either side, you fall. Dissolve too much, and you lose form. Forge too strongly, and you lose freedom. So you begin to live in a delicate balance. Like a dancer who moves freely, yet with precision. Like a flame that has shape, yet is never fixed. You allow identity to arise when needed, and to fall away when it is not. You play roles, but you do not become them. You express yourself, but you do not confine yourself. And slowly, a new way of being emerges, not based on certainty, not rooted in definition, but grounded in awareness. You are no longer asking, "Who am I?" Nor are you declaring, "This is who I am." Instead, you are simply living, responding, creating, dissolving, becoming, without the burden of needing to arrive at a final identity. And perhaps this is the quiet truth that reveals itself. Identity is not something to hold. It is something to use, and then release. Like a word spoken in conversation. Meaningful in the moment, but not meant to be carried forever. So the question is no longer about finding or fixing your identity. It is something far more subtle. Can you create yourself without becoming trapped in what you create? Can you dissolve what no longer serves, without falling into emptiness? Can you forge what is needed, without turning it into a cage? Sit with this, because the answer will not come as a conclusion. It will come as a way of living, a way that cannot be explained fully, only experienced moment by moment as identity rises and falls like breath. Chapter 4: Emptiness of Being versus Assertion of Becoming. Before you were given a name, before anyone told you who you are, before you learned to say, "I," there was already a presence. Not a person, not an identity, just a silent, open field in which everything appeared. And even now, beneath all your thoughts, beneath your desires and fears, that same openness remains, untouched, undefined, and strangely distant from the life you think you are living. You rarely notice it, because your attention is always moving, toward what you want, away from what you fear, constructing meaning, building continuity. You are busy becoming, and in this constant movement, the stillness of being fades into the background. But sometimes, without warning, everything slows down. A moment of deep silence. A pause between thoughts. A space where nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be removed. In that moment, there is no urgency to become anything. No pressure to define yourself. No need to move forward. There is only this, complete, sufficient, and empty. And yet, the mind does not trust this emptiness. It becomes restless. It whispers, "This is not enough. You must become something. You must move, achieve, create, define." And so the movement begins again. This is the tension between being and becoming. Being is empty, still, and complete. Becoming is active, restless, and driven. At first glance, they seem opposed. One invites you to dissolve, the other urges you to rise. One asks you to let go, the other demands that you take hold. But look deeper, and you will see they are not enemies. They are two movements of the same existence. The problem arises only when you cling to one and reject the other. If you cling to being, if you retreat into stillness, into emptiness, into detachment, you may find peace, but it is a fragile peace. It avoids the chaos of life rather than transforming it. It becomes an escape disguised as wisdom. You may say, "Nothing matters. Everything is empty." And in this statement, there is truth, but also avoidance. Because life is not asking you only to observe. It is asking you to participate. On the other hand, if you cling to becoming, if you are always striving, always asserting, always trying to shape yourself and the world, you may feel powerful, purposeful, alive. But beneath that movement, there is often a quiet tension, a sense that you are never enough as you are. You become a project, always incomplete. You say, I will become something great. And in this statement, there is fire, but also dissatisfaction. Because becoming is endless. No matter what you achieve, there is always another step, another goal, another version of yourself waiting to be reached. So where does this leave you? Between stillness and movement. Between emptiness and assertion. Between being and becoming. And the mind, once again, seeks a conclusion. It wants to know which one is right. Which path should I follow? But existence does not offer such simplicity. Because both are necessary, and neither is complete on its own. Emptiness of being reveals that you are not lacking. Assertion of becoming allows you to express what is possible. Without emptiness, becoming becomes desperate. Without becoming, emptiness becomes stagnant. So the question is not which one to choose. The question is whether you can allow both to coexist within you. Can you rest in the completeness of being, without losing the fire to become? Can you act with intensity and purpose, without losing the awareness that nothing you become defines you? This is not a balance you achieve once and hold forever. It is a living tension, a rhythm, like breathing, in and out, expansion and contraction. When you inhale, you take in the world. When you exhale, you release it. If you only inhale, you suffocate. If you only exhale, you collapse. Life happens in the movement between the two. In the same way, there are moments to rest in being, to do nothing, to become no one, to simply exist without purpose. And there are moments to assert becoming, to create, to act, to shape your life with clarity and force. The wisdom lies in knowing when to allow each. But this knowing does not come from rules. It comes from awareness, from being present enough to feel when action is true and when it is driven by fear, when stillness is alive and when it is avoidance. Because the surface may look the same, but the source is different. You can sit in silence because you are at peace or because you are afraid to act. You can strive toward a goal because it expresses your deepest clarity or because you are trying to escape yourself. The outer action does not reveal the truth. Only awareness does. And as this awareness deepens, something begins to shift. You no longer see being and becoming as opposites. You begin to experience becoming as an expression of being. Action arising from stillness. Movement emerging from silence. You act, but not to complete yourself. You create, but not to prove yourself. You become, but without losing your ground in being. It is like a wave rising from the ocean. The wave has form, movement, direction. It becomes something. But it never ceases to be the ocean. In the same way, your actions, your creations, your becoming, these are waves. But beneath them, there remains an emptiness that is not lacking, not incomplete. And when you forget this, you suffer. You begin to believe that the wave must sustain itself, must prove its existence, must become something permanent. But the wave cannot hold itself together. It rises and it falls. And that is its nature. So too with your becoming. Let it rise. Let it fall. Do not cling to what you become. Do not resist what dissolves. Because what you are is not limited to either. And yet, even this understanding must not become a fixed belief. Because the moment you say, I have understood, you have already turned a living insight into a static idea. So remain open. Remain in the tension. Let yourself feel both the stillness of being and the fire of becoming. Let them meet within you, without forcing a resolution. And perhaps, in that meeting, something entirely new begins to emerge. Not a final answer, not a perfect state, but a way of living that is both grounded and alive, both empty and full of movement. And in that, there is a quiet harmony, not because the tension has disappeared, but because you are no longer trying to escape it. Chapter 5: The Illusion of I versus the Power of I Will. Every thought you have ever called mine arrived uninvited. It appeared, lingered for a moment, and then faded, just like the sound of wind passing through trees. Yet somewhere in this fleeting movement, a voice quietly claimed ownership. I am thinking this. But who is this I? If you look closely, you will not find it. You will find thoughts, yes. You will find sensations, impulses, reactions. But the one who claims them, the one who says I think, I feel, I choose, remains strangely absent, like a shadow that cannot be touched. And yet, this illusion is powerful. Because once the idea of I takes hold, everything begins to revolve around it. Every experience is filtered through it. Every action becomes my action. Every success my achievement. Every failure my burden. The world becomes personal. And in that personalization, suffering begins. Not because life itself is suffering, but because the illusion of I turns every movement into something that must be protected, enhanced, or defended. A simple insult becomes a wound. A passing failure becomes a permanent scar. A moment of joy becomes something to cling to. All because there is an I at the center, holding everything together. But if you observe carefully, you will begin to notice something unsettling. The I is never present at the beginning of an experience. First comes the sensation, the thought, the reaction. Only afterward does the mind say, "This happened to me." The I is not the source. It is the narrator. It arrives late, but speaks as if it has always been there. And because of this, you believe that you are the doer, the thinker, the chooser. But are you? When anger arises, did you choose it? When fear grips you, did you invite it? When a sudden insight appears, did you create it? Or did these things simply happen, like weather passing through the sky? If they happen on their own, then what remains of the I that claims control? This is the illusion that must be seen. Not destroyed, not denied, but understood. Because the illusion of I is not just a mistake. It is also a function. It organizes experience. It creates continuity. It allows you to navigate the world. But the problem arises when you mistake the function for a fact. When you believe that the I is something real, fixed, and central. That is when the illusion becomes a prison. And yet, just as you begin to see through this illusion, another force arises, equally powerful, but of a different nature. It does not say, "I am." It says, "I will." This is not the passive I that claims ownership after the fact. This is an active movement, a direction, a force, a decision. But here is the paradox. If the I is an illusion, then who is it that says, "I will"? Who is making this assertion? At first, this seems like a contradiction. But look deeper. The illusion of I is tied to identity, to the idea that there is a fixed self who exists and owns experiences. The power of I will is not about identity. It is about direction. It is not saying, "This is who I am." It is saying, "This is the movement I choose." And this movement does not require a fixed self to exist. Just as a river flows without a permanent identity, just as a flame burns without a fixed form, there can be action, direction, and force without a solid I behind it. I will is not a statement of existence. It is a declaration of intention. But even here, caution is needed, because the mind can easily convert I will into another form of ego. It can turn intention into identity. It can say, "I am strong. I am disciplined. I am powerful." And once again, the fluid movement becomes a rigid definition. The power is lost. True, I will is free from identity. It does not need to declare itself. It simply acts. It moves forward without constantly referring back to a self-image. It does not say, "I am the kind of person who does this." It just does. And in that doing, there is a certain purity, a directness, an absence of unnecessary thought. But this is not the same as unconscious action. It is not impulse, not reaction. It is clarity in motion, a movement that arises not from conditioning, but from awareness. And this is where the real transformation begins. When you see that the I is an illusion, you are no longer bound by the need to protect it. When you discover the power of I will, you are no longer passive within that freedom. You become capable of acting without being trapped by identity. But this requires a subtle shift. You must stop asking, "Who is doing this?" and begin to observe, what is being done, and from where does it arise? Is your action coming from fear, from habit, from the need to prove something? Or is it coming from clarity, from a deeper understanding that does not rely on identity? Because the same action can come from very different sources. You can act with discipline because you are afraid of failure. Or you can act with discipline because you see its value clearly. Outwardly, both look the same. Inwardly, they are entirely different. One reinforces the illusion of I. The other expresses the power of I will. So the question is not whether you act or not. The question is, from where does your action arise? And this cannot be answered intellectually. It must be observed moment by moment, because the illusion of I is subtle. It hides in language, in thought, in the very structure of how you experience the world. Even now, as you read these words, there is a tendency to interpret them through a sense of self. What does this mean for me? But what if, for a moment, you let go of that center? What if you simply allowed the words to arise and pass, without attaching them to an I? What remains? There is still awareness, still understanding, still presence, but without the weight of ownership. And from that place, action can still arise. Decisions can still be made. Life can still be lived. But it is lighter, less burdened, less confined. And perhaps this is the deeper realization. You do not need a solid I to act. You do not need a fixed identity to move forward. You do not need to know who you are to choose a direction. The illusion of I can fall away, and yet the power of I will can remain. Not as a contradiction, but as a transformation. From ownership to movement. From identity to intention. From being someone to simply acting with clarity and force. And in that shift, something quiet but profound begins to emerge. A way of living where you are no longer defined by what you think you are, but guided by what you see clearly must be done. Not because you must do it, but because, in that moment, it is the only thing that makes sense. Chapter 6: Beyond Ego versus the Rise of Ego. The ego is not what you think it is. It is not simply pride nor arrogance, nor the loud assertion of superiority. These are only its most visible expressions, like waves on the surface of an ocean. The ego itself runs deeper, quieter, more hidden. It is there when you feel insulted. It is there when you feel proud. It is there when you compare, when you defend, when you explain yourself unnecessarily, when you replay conversations in your mind, shaping them in your favor. But it is also there when you feel inferior, when you doubt yourself, when you shrink, hesitate, or avoid. Because the ego does not only say, I am greater. It also says, I am lesser. Both are forms of the same illusion. The belief that there is a fixed I that must be measured, positioned, and protected. And so, whether you rise above others or fall beneath them, the ego remains intact. It feeds on comparison. It thrives on distinction. It exists only in relation to something else. Without comparison, the ego begins to fade. Without a story to maintain, it loses its ground. This is why moments of deep presence feel so different. In those moments, you are not thinking about yourself. You are not measuring, not comparing, not evaluating. You are simply here. And in that simplicity, the ego is absent. Not destroyed, not suppressed, just not needed. This is what it means to go beyond ego. Not to fight it, not to eliminate it by force, but to see it so clearly that it no longer dominates your perception. Because the more you try to destroy the ego, the more subtly it survives. It can even turn humility into a new identity. I am the one who has no ego. And in that statement, the ego returns, refined, disguised, but still present. So the path beyond ego is not a battle. It is an understanding, a seeing. You begin to notice how often your actions are driven by the need to maintain an image. How often your thoughts revolve around how you are perceived. How often your emotions are tied to the idea of yourself. And as you see this, something begins to loosen. Not because you are trying to change it, but because you are no longer fully identified with it. You begin to recognize the ego as a pattern, not a truth. And in that recognition, there is space. But here, once again, a subtle danger appears. Because as the ego loosens, as its grip weakens, there can arise a sense of emptiness. A loss of structure. A quiet question. If I am not this identity, then what remains? And in that uncertainty, there is a temptation to rebuild. To create a new sense of self, more refined, more powerful, more deliberate. Not unconsciously this time, but intentionally. This is where the rise of ego begins. But this ego is different. It is not inherited. It is constructed. Not imposed, it is chosen. It does not arise from conditioning alone, but from a conscious assertion. At first, this may seem like a step backward. After all, if the ego is an illusion, why would you allow it to rise again? But look deeper. The unconscious ego binds you. The conscious ego can serve you. The difference is not in its existence, but in your relationship to it. When you are unaware, the ego controls you. When you are aware, you can use it. Like a tool. like a mask that you wear when needed and remove when it is not. The problem was never the presence of ego. The problem was the belief that it was who you are. So the rise of ego, in this sense, is not a return to illusion. It is a transformation of function. You begin to shape your way of being, not out of fear, not out of comparison, but out of clarity. You may choose to be assertive. You may choose to be disciplined. You may choose to express strength, confidence, direction. But you do not cling to these as your identity. You use them as expressions. And this requires a certain precision, because the line between using the ego and becoming it is very thin. You can say, I will act with strength and remain free. Or you can say, I am strong, and begin to build a new identity. The first is fluid. The second becomes fixed. The first allows change. The second resists it. So the question is not whether the ego rises. It will rise. In some form, it must. Because life requires interaction, expression, decision. And all of these involve a sense of self, however light or temporary. The question is, can the ego rise without becoming your master? Can you embody qualities without being trapped by them? Can you speak, act, create, assert, without turning these movements into a solid I? This is not easy, because the mind seeks stability. It wants to hold on to something, to say, this is who I am. But the more you hold, the more you become rigid. And rigidity is the beginning of suffering. So you begin to live differently. You allow the ego to appear when needed, when you must act, decide, engage with the world. But you do not carry it unnecessarily. When the moment passes, you let it dissolve. Like a role in a play, fully embodied while it lasts, but not mistaken for your true nature. And in this, a new kind of freedom emerges. Not the freedom of having no ego at all, but the freedom of not being bound by it. You can be strong without needing to prove it. You can be humble without needing to define yourself that way. You can act decisively without constructing a rigid identity around your actions. You become adaptable, fluid, responsive, and beneath it all, there remains a quiet awareness that does not change. An awareness that does not need to assert itself, does not need to rise or fall. It simply observes. And from that observation, everything else becomes lighter, even the ego. So perhaps the aim is not to go beyond ego in the sense of eliminating it completely, and not to fully embrace it as your identity, but to understand it so deeply that it loses its power to bind you, to let it rise when needed, and to let it fall without resistance, like a wave that does not forget it is water. And in that remembering, there is a subtle shift. You no longer fear the ego, and you no longer depend on it. You simply allow it, without becoming it. Chapter 7. Silence of Self versus Expression of Self. There is a silence within you that has never spoken, and yet it has never been absent. It does not argue, does not explain, does not seek to be heard. It does not say I, and it does not resist what is. It simply remains, unchanging, untouched by the movements of your life. And yet you rarely notice it, because your existence, as you know it, is filled with expression. You speak, you react, you explain yourself, you shape words to convey meaning, to assert presence, to leave an imprint. Even in silence, there is often an internal dialogue, a constant whispering of thoughts, interpreting, judging, narrating. You're almost always expressing. And so the deeper silence remains hidden, not because it is far away, but because it is too close, too still, too simple for a mind that seeks movement. But sometimes, unexpectedly, expression stops. Not forced, not suppressed. It simply pauses. A moment where there is no need to say anything, no urge to define or respond. A moment where even the inner voice falls quiet. In that moment, something is revealed. Not as an idea, but as a direct experience. You are still here, without speaking, without thinking, without expressing. And yet, nothing is missing. This is the silence of self. Not the silence of repression, not the silence of holding back, but a natural stillness in which the need to express dissolves. In this silence, there is no image to maintain, no identity to present, no narrative to continue. There is only presence, complete, sufficient, and strangely free. And yet, as soon as this silence is noticed, the mind returns. It asks, what is this? How do I keep it? What does it mean? And with that, expression begins again. Words arise. Interpretations form. The silence is covered, not lost but obscured. This is the rhythm you live in, often without awareness. Silence gives way to expression. Expression dissolves back into silence. But you have learned to value one over the other. You have been taught that expression is life. That to speak, to act, to create, to assert, is to exist fully. And there is truth in this. Because without expression, life would remain hidden, unformed, unshared. A song unheard. A thought unspoken. A potential unrealized. Expression is how existence becomes visible. How the invisible takes shape. How the inner finds its way into the outer world. And yet, when expression is constant, when there is no return to silence, it becomes noise. Endless, restless, exhausting. Words without depth. Actions without clarity. A life driven by the need to constantly affirm itself. And in this noise, something essential is lost. Not destroyed, but drowned out. The silence that gives expression its meaning. Because without silence, expression has no root. It becomes reactive, superficial, disconnected. So you begin to see that silence and expression are not opposites. They are complements. Silence is the source. Expression is the movement. Silence is the ground. Expression is the form. But here, once again, the mind creates division. It says silence is higher. Expression is lower. Or it says expression is powerful. Silence is passive. And in this division, imbalance arises. If you cling to silence, you may withdraw from life. You may avoid speaking, avoid acting, avoid engaging, mistaking stillness for truth. But this silence is incomplete, because it denies the natural movement of life. On the other hand, if you cling to expression, you may lose yourself in activity. Constant speaking, constant doing, constant becoming, without ever touching the stillness beneath. And this expression is empty, because it has no source. So the question is not whether to be silent or expressive. The question is whether your expression arises from silence or from noise. Because the same words can carry entirely different qualities. You can speak from a restless mind, trying to prove something, trying to fill space. Or you can speak from silence, where each word is grounded, necessary, alive. In the first, words create confusion. In the second, they reveal something deeper. The same is true for action. You can act from agitation, from the need to assert yourself. Or you can act from stillness, where action is precise, effortless, aligned. Outwardly, both may look similar. Inwardly, they are worlds apart. So the real shift is not in what you do, but in where it comes from. And to discover this, you must become sensitive to silence. Not as an escape, but as a living presence. You must learn to pause, not as a technique, but as a natural return. To notice the space between thoughts, the stillness beneath emotions, the quiet that remains even when everything else is moving. And in this noticing, something changes. You no longer feel the need to constantly express. You begin to speak less, but with more depth. You act less, but with more clarity. You allow silence to shape your expression. And in doing so, expression becomes more powerful, not less. Because it is no longer driven by the need to be seen. It becomes an extension of what is already complete. Like a tree that does not try to prove its existence, but simply grows. Its expression is not forced. It is natural, effortless, and yet fully alive. But even here, caution is needed. Because the mind may take pride in silence. It may say, I am one who is silent, who speaks only when necessary. And once again, identity forms. The silence becomes a role, a subtle ego. So even silence must be held lightly. Not claimed, not defined, just lived. The same with expression. Let it arise when needed. Let it fall when it is done. Do not cling to either. Because both are movements within something deeper. Something that cannot be spoken and does not need to be. And perhaps this is the quiet realization. You are not the silence. You are not the expression. You are that in which both appear and disappear. So you do not need to choose. You do not need to decide when to be silent and when to express. If you are aware, the moment will reveal itself. Sometimes silence will come naturally. Sometimes words will flow. And in both, there will be no conflict. Only a seamless movement. A harmony that cannot be forced. Only allowed. So the question is not, should I speak or remain silent? It is something far more subtle. Can you allow silence to exist within you, even as you express? Can you speak without losing the stillness? Can you act without leaving the ground of being? Sit with this, because in that meeting of silence and expression, something begins to awaken. Not louder, not quieter, but deeper. Chapter 8. Letting go of self versus becoming who you are. You have been told in countless ways to become who you are. It sounds noble, almost sacred, as if somewhere within you, hidden beneath layers of confusion, there exists a true self, pure, complete, waiting to be uncovered. And so you search. You look within. You analyze your thoughts, your desires, your tendencies. You try to separate what is authentic from what is conditioned. You ask, what is my true nature? Who am I really? But the deeper you go, the more elusive it becomes. Every answer you find feels temporary. Every identity you claim eventually begins to crack. Because what you discover is not a fixed essence, but a movement. A shifting field of experiences, constantly changing, never settling into something permanent. And slowly, a different realization begins to emerge. Perhaps there is no fixed self to become. Perhaps the idea of a true self is itself another construction, more refined, more appealing, but still an idea. And if this is so, then what does it mean to become who you are? At the same time, another voice speaks, equally compelling, but moving in the opposite direction. It does not ask you to discover yourself. It asks you to create yourself, to rise beyond what you have been, to shape your life with intention, to carve meaning out of uncertainty. It says, do not wait to find who you are, decide who you will be. And again, you are caught between two movements. One invites you to let go of all identity. The other urges you to become something defined. One dissolves. The other builds. So which is true? Must you abandon the search for self, or commit to the act of becoming? Look carefully. The problem lies not in either movement, but in how you hold them. When you try to become who you are, as if there is a fixed truth waiting to be discovered, you create a subtle tension. You begin to measure yourself against an ideal. You say, this is not yet me, but I will reach it. And in that gap, dissatisfaction is born. Because the self you are trying to become always remains just out of reach. You chase it, refine it, adjust it, but it never fully arrives. Why? Because it was never there to begin with. It is a projection, a concept shaped by your preferences, your fears, your influences. So the more you chase it, the further you move from what is actually here. On the other hand, when you let go of the idea of self completely, when you say, there is no one to become, nothing to define, there is a certain freedom. The pressure dissolves. The constant striving softens. You no longer feel the need to fix yourself. But this, too, can become incomplete. Because life does not stop moving. Even if there is no fixed self, there are still choices to be made, directions to be taken, actions to be lived. And if you withdraw entirely, if you remain only in letting go, you may find yourself drifting without clarity, without depth. So again, the answer is not in choosing one over the other. It is in understanding their relationship. Letting go of self does not mean abandoning life. Becoming who you are does not mean discovering a fixed essence. It means something far more subtle. You let go of the idea that there is a permanent identity to hold on to. And from that freedom, you begin to shape your way of being, not as a final definition, but as an ongoing creation. You do not become who you are. You become what you live. And what you live is not fixed. It evolves, refines, transforms. So the question shifts. It is no longer, who am I meant to be? It becomes, what am I choosing to express here and now? And this choice is not made once. It is made continuously, in every action, in every response, in every moment of awareness. But here, a subtle danger remains. The mind may turn this into another project, another identity. I am someone who is becoming. I am someone who has let go. And once again, the movement becomes fixed. So even this must be held lightly. You must let go not only of the old self, but of the new one you are creating. Not by rejecting it, but by not clinging to it. You act, you shape, you express, but you do not hold on to the result as who you are. You allow it to change, to dissolve, to be replaced, like seasons shifting. No season defines the earth, and no identity defines you. And yet, each season has its own beauty, its own necessity. In the same way, each version of you has its moment, its purpose, its expression, but it is not permanent, and it does not need to be. So becoming who you are is not about reaching a final state. It is about engaging fully in the process, without needing it to end in certainty. It is about living with direction, without demanding definition. And letting go of self is not about disappearing. It is about releasing the need to fix yourself into something unchanging. When these two movements come together, something shifts. You are no longer searching for yourself, and you are no longer trying to become a fixed version of yourself. You are simply living aware, responsive, creative. There is a lightness in this, because you are not burdened by the past, not constrained by identity. And yet, there is also a depth, because you are not drifting aimlessly. You are choosing, acting, shaping your life with clarity, but without clinging to what you shape. And perhaps this is the quiet truth. You do not need to become who you are, and you do not need to let go of yourself completely. You need only to see that both are movements, not destinations. And in that seeing, something relaxes. The struggle to define yourself fades. The pressure to arrive dissolves. And what remains is something simple. A life that is lived, moment by moment, without needing to be held together by a fixed idea of you. Chapter 9. The Void Within versus the Will Within. There is a space within you that no experience has ever filled. Not success, not love, not understanding, not even the deepest moments of peace. Everything that enters this space eventually fades, leaving it as it was, open, silent, untouched. At times, you feel it clearly. In moments when distraction falls away, when the noise of life softens, when you are left alone, not just physically, but inwardly. There is a subtle emptiness, difficult to describe, impossible to grasp. And the mind, encountering this void, becomes uneasy. It asks, what is missing? It assumes that this space must be filled. So it begins to search for meaning, for purpose, for identity, for connection. Anything that can cover this emptiness, anything that can give it shape. And for a while, it works. You find something, a goal, a relationship, a belief, and the void seems to disappear. It feels as though you have finally found what you were looking for, but only temporarily, because what you have found exists within the field of experience, and the void is not part of that field. It is deeper. It is not something that can be filled, because it is not lacking. It only appears as lack when seen through the lens of desire. So the search continues, endlessly. And this is the first misunderstanding. The void within is not a problem. It is not something to escape, not something to resolve. It is a fundamental aspect of your being, open, ungraspable, beyond definition. But this realization is not comforting at first. Because if the void cannot be filled, then what is the point of striving? What is the meaning of becoming, of creating, of willing anything at all? If everything arises and fades, if nothing remains, then why act? Why move? Why care? And here, another force begins to rise, equally undeniable, but moving in the opposite direction. The will. Not the superficial will that says, I want this or I must achieve that, but something deeper, a quiet intensity, a movement toward expression, toward creation, toward shaping life. It does not ask whether the void can be filled. It does not seek permanence. It simply moves. And this movement is powerful. It builds, it transforms, it pushes against limitation. It gives direction to life. Without it, existence would remain passive, drifting without form. So now you stand between two realities. The void within, silent, empty, unchanging. The will within, active, expressive, constantly moving. And once again, the mind seeks resolution. It asks, which is true? Should I surrender to the void or follow the will? But this question itself is incomplete, because it assumes that the two are separate, that the void negates the will, or the will denies the void. Look deeper. The void does not resist the will. It does not oppose it. It simply does not depend on it. The will, in turn, does not fill the void. It arises within it, like a flame burning in open space. The space does not need the flame, but the flame cannot exist without the space. In the same way, your will, your drive, your movement, your becoming, emerges from a ground that is empty, silent, and untouched. And when you forget this, suffering begins. If you try to use the will to escape the void, to fill it, to cover it, you will always fail. Because no action, no achievement, no identity can reach that depth. The more you try, the more restless you become. The more you achieve, the more the void remains. But if you reject the will entirely, if you retreat into the void, into stillness, into detachment, You may find peace, but it will lack vitality. It will be a quiet emptiness, without movement, without expression. And something in you will feel incomplete. Because life is not only stillness, it is also movement. So again, the truth lies not in choosing one over the other, but in understanding their relationship. The void within is your ground. The will within is your movement. The void is not something to fill. The will is not something to suppress. When you see this clearly, something shifts. You stop trying to escape the void. You allow it. You let it remain as it is, open, silent, untouched. And from that allowing, the will begins to change. It is no longer driven by lack, no longer desperate, no longer trying to complete something that feels incomplete. It becomes an expression, a movement that arises not because something is missing, but because something is alive. You act, not to fill the void, but to express the energy that moves through you. You create, not to define yourself, but because creation itself becomes natural. You will, not out of necessity, but out of possibility. And in this, the quality of your actions transforms. They become lighter, freer, less burdened by outcome, because you are no longer trying to resolve something through them. You are simply allowing them to unfold. But this requires a deep honesty, because the mind is subtle. It can disguise its attempts to escape the void as purpose, as growth, as becoming. It can turn the will into a tool of avoidance. So you must watch carefully. You must ask, not intellectually, but through awareness. Is this movement arising from clarity, or from the need to escape emptiness? And the answer will not come in words. It will be felt. A movement driven by lack feels tense, urgent, restless. A movement arising from clarity feels steady, grounded, alive. Both can be intense, but one is heavy, the other is light. So you begin to trust this feeling, not as a rule, but as a sensitivity. And slowly, your relationship with the void changes. It no longer feels like something to fear. It becomes something you can rest in, even as you act, even as you move. And your relationship with the will changes as well. It no longer feels like a struggle. It becomes a natural extension of being, like breathing, effortless yet essential. And in this meeting of void and will, something deeper begins to emerge. A way of living where emptiness and expression are no longer in conflict, where you can sit in silence without needing to move, and move with intensity without losing your silence, where the void remains untouched, and yet the will dances freely within it. So perhaps the question is not whether the void should be filled, nor whether the will should be followed. Perhaps the question is, can you allow the void to remain empty, while still allowing the will to move? Can you live without trying to resolve the emptiness, and still act with clarity and force? Sit with this, because in that space, something begins to open, not as an answer, but as a way of being, a way that does not try to escape the void, nor become trapped within it, a way that simply lives. Chapter 10, Freedom from Self versus Freedom through Self. There are two kinds of freedom, and most people spend their lives moving between them without ever seeing the difference. One says, be free from yourself. The other whispers, be free through yourself. At first, they appear to point in opposite directions. One invites you to dissolve, the other to rise. One loosens identity, the other sharpens it. And so you hesitate, uncertain which path leads to truth. But perhaps the deeper confusion is not in the paths themselves. It is in the assumption that freedom must belong to one side. Look closely at your life. Every struggle you have known has been tied, in some way, to the idea of yourself. You suffer not only because of pain, but because it is your pain. You fear not only because of uncertainty, but because it threatens you. You desire not only because something is beautiful, but because you want it to complete you. The self becomes the center around which everything revolves. And in that center, tension builds. Because the self must be maintained, protected, proven, sustained against the constant movement of life. This is why the idea of freedom from self is so powerful. It suggests that if the self itself is seen through, if the illusion of a fixed I dissolves, then all this tension may fall away. No one to defend, no one to compare, no one to be hurt in the same way. And indeed, when the sense of self loosens, something remarkable happens. Experience continues, but without the same weight. Pain arises, but it is not owned. Thoughts appear, but they are not believed as deeply. Life moves, but without the constant need to refer back to a center. There is a lightness, a simplicity, a quiet freedom. You begin to see that much of what you carried was never necessary. And yet, this is not the end, because even in this freedom, life continues to unfold. Choices still arise. Actions still matter. The world does not disappear simply because the self is no longer taken as solid. And here, another question emerges. If there is no fixed self, then how do you live? Not theoretically, but practically. How do you act, decide, create, engage? Do you simply drift, allowing life to happen? Or do you take part in shaping it? This is where the second kind of freedom reveals itself. Freedom through self. But understand this carefully. This is not a return to the old illusion. Not a rebuilding of a rigid identity. It is something more subtle. It is the recognition that even if the self is not fixed, it can still function. It can still act as a point of expression, a way through which life moves into form. The difference is that now you are no longer bound by it. You do not believe it to be ultimate. You do not cling to it as your essence. You use it, like a tool, like a lens, like a voice through which something deeper speaks. And in this, a new kind of freedom emerges. Not the freedom of having no self at all, but the freedom of not being limited by the self you express. You can take on roles, identities, directions, without becoming trapped in them. You can say, "This is what I will do," without saying, "This is who I permanently am." You can act with strength, clarity, purpose, without needing those qualities to define you. And this changes everything, because now, action is no longer tied to identity. You do not act to reinforce who you are. You act because the action itself is clear, necessary, alive. In this way, the self becomes a doorway, not a prison, a means of engagement, not a fixed center. But again, there is a danger, because the mind can subtly return to old patterns. It can take this freedom and turn it into a new identity. I am free. I am beyond the self. I act without attachment. And once again, the self reappears, refined, elevated, but still present as something to hold on to. So even here, vigilance is needed. Not as effort, but as awareness. A continuous seeing that whatever you define yourself as, even freedom, is still a concept, still a form, still something that can be clung to. So what remains when both are seen clearly? Freedom from self removes the illusion. Freedom through self allows expression. One clears the ground, the other builds upon it. But neither is complete alone, because to remain only in freedom from self is to risk detachment from life. And to remain only in freedom through self is to risk falling back into identity. So the real freedom is not in choosing between them. It is in moving between them, effortlessly, naturally, without conflict. To dissolve when needed, to assert when needed, to be no one, and yet to act as someone, without confusion, without attachment, like an actor who fully embodies a role, yet never forgets that it is a role. But even this analogy falls short, because there is no fixed script, no predefined character. You are both the stage and the movement upon it, both the silence and the expression, both the absence of self and the appearance of it. And when this is seen, not intellectually but directly, something quiet settles. The search ends, not because you have found a final answer, but because the need for one dissolves. You no longer ask, "How can I be free?" Because you see that freedom was never something to achieve. It was something obscured by the belief in a fixed self, and something expressed through the movement of life itself. So you live, not as a defined identity, not as an absence either, but as a fluid presence, empty yet active, unbound yet fully engaged. And in this, there is a simplicity that cannot be explained, only lived, moment by moment, without needing to hold on to anything, not even freedom itself.